So we're having a lot of problems getting these riparian buffers established on the landscape, especially with the agricultural communities, which is where we need to establish a lot of these buffers. So we did this feasibility study of ways that we can explore to actually make these buffers more appealing to our agricultural landowners. And here's some of our partners that we worked with on this project. The reason we're having problems is because our agricultural landowners, and the way these are regulated right now is they're these no-touch buffer zones that get established and at 50 to 150 feet, depending on the type of stream that we're dealing with. And the landowner is not supposed to touch it in any manner. And our landowners see this as a real an actual physical barrier on their landscape, and they also see there's also this real cultural barrier to this because they feel that they're losing the agency of their landscape. They feel that they're losing some type of control of their landscape, and in some circumstances they are losing areas that they would like to be productive in some way for them. So to try and make this more appealing to our landowners, we decided to explore this working buffers concept, to come up with this concept where they would establish these riparian buffers, but we would allow them these zones within those buffers that they could still harvest different crops and actually diversify what they're doing on their landscape, which could have other benefits for them. And what we were finding through going through this is you're getting that riparian benefit, you're getting those water quality benefits that you would get with a riparian zone, but you're also giving a benefit to the landowner by, like I said, this diversity in income, this diversity in crops. And actually, at the end of the day, we did find that with landowners who were willing to do this, we were actually getting a net gain in riparian area. So we were getting, more trees on the landscape in these riparian zones overall. So what do we mean by a working buffer? Basically taking agroforestry practices and applying them to the riparian buffers. And we're probably all fairly familiar with agroforestry, but we're just adding trees and perennial crops into our agricultural systems. So this is just to kind of illustrate what we are talking about. So we're zoning these buffers out. So we have this zone 1, which is your traditional riparian space. It's undisturbed, it's got that traditional riparian function. And then we're allowing our landowners to go out into this sort of zone 2 riparian space where they're going to manage, harvest, and do, produce in this zone. And then we might have this third zone with some runoff control or a transition zone for pollinators or things like that. These are some of the practices that landowners are taking on, some of the agroforestry practices, forest farming. Looks just like a normal riparian buffer. It's taking advantage of a forest ecosystem, but using that to produce. So you might have nut crops, berry crops. You might grow high-value mushroom crops within these systems. But it's a traditional forest space, but you're managing it for production of certain high-value crops. Alley cropping looks a lot more like a traditional agricultural system where you're adding these rows of trees and extending that out from the riparian zone onto the landscape, and then you're planting your annual crops in between those areas. Silvopasture, allowing livestock to encroach into some of these treed landscapes. These are actually really interesting systems. They actually have benefits for not only the trees and the forage, but the livestock as well. So livestock are shown to gain more weight, to have better milk production in these types of systems. It's shown that the forage actually has a longer growing system overall, and the trees tend to grow better and faster in systems like this if they're managed properly. And then biomass is another crop alternative to add on to these spaces to increase that buffer area to get that more trees on that landscape. We do have landowners that have been using the other three systems. We don't have landowners who have been using this yet because there's no market for this in our area that anyone's familiar with at this point. So again, why we did this, the fixed buffer width idea being easy for regulators to go on and say, everybody put a 100-foot buffer on, but really not feasible for landowners or for practitioners. And for practitioners, we are really asking for, and we really need that flexibility to convince our landowners to put these in. They need some kind of incentive to put these in on their landscape. I'm just going to kind of skirt through this really quick. This was a lot of the science that we looked at with the regulation being a 100-foot or 150-foot buffer. What does the science say? Is that necessary? And this just synthesizes lots of the different reports we looked through. And you can see the wide range depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Maybe pollution removal. You've got anywhere between 13 to 860-foot buffer that can be effective. Depending on sediment removal, we're looking at 26 to 600 feet. So these are wide ranges of the spacing that you would need to be effective. Here's another one that shows a similar thing. And the reason that there is this huge, I don't know, good word, this big, spacing for what is effective is because of all these factors when you're looking at a buffer. Soil type, slope, vegetation, they're very site specific, they're very land use specific, all these different things that factor into what makes a buffer effective for what you're trying to do. Flow dispersal came out as a real important one. So you might have a 200-foot buffer, but if you have concentrated flow going over that buffer, it's not going to be as effective as if you had more of a sheet flow going across that landscape. So having the flexibility to go out on these, to go out with these landowners on their landscape, looking at all these variables, and then designing for this flow dispersal across these buffers can really allow for a lot of flexibility in how you design these buffers on their landscapes. That's just kind of a graphic to kind of illustrate that. These I won't go into too much. These are some of the designs that we worked up for some different landowners, showing how we would design for flow dispersal across these areas, showing your traditional riparian areas, and then practices coming off of there. One of our small farm examples, they have a fairly good buffer on their stream here, but they were interested in trying more of these practices and extending these buffers out and working in berry crops and things like that. And so now what we have is just a much wider buffer on this landscape, but they're still productive with it. Another one, we also, in our county, most of our farmers are very small. Okay, we're talking 50 acres might be one of our bigger operations. So when you're asking them to put buffers, significant buffers on streams within their landscape, they can actually be pulling a lot of land out of production. So again, allowing them to use this space. This represents a 35-foot buffer on either side, and you can kind of see the boundaries of their property here. It's not huge, so that's significant for them. So allowing them to work at the edge of this buffer really can incentivize them to actually establish this on that stream, and allowing to plan for a 35-foot buffer instead of a 100-foot buffer on that I mean, if you put a 100-foot buffer on that, they're going to have no land there anymore. This is one of our commercial farms we designed. This red here represents a CREP buffer, which is, again, one of those no-touch buffers that was established through the CREP program. They're not allowed to do anything within that buffer. And so that's what we got through that program with them. But then these other sort of areas represent, excuse me, represent other practices, these agroforestry practices that this landowner decided to diversify with. And you can see the net benefit of buffer width that we got off of that. So a lot more tree cover on that landscape. Really quick, again, kind of covering why we did this. Our landowners, they understand water quality. They're open to doing these buffers, but again, they're really hesitant to give up much of their space because these buffers have been regulated as no-touch zones. And a lot of them, again, the big thing is, retaining ownership, retaining agency within those spaces. Again, it makes sense for farmers, for all the different reasons. Adding these trees to their landscape can have huge benefits on their landscape and in their production systems. And then we're getting those ecological benefits from getting these riparian zones on the landscape in the first place and getting a net gain in these zones. I won't go into that. I'm running out of time. Next steps, how we need to push these programs forward, allowing practitioners to have that flexibility to design these buffers for people, and allowing this concept of being able to work within these buffer spaces and make them productive with whatever kinds of crops. So that's it for me at the moment.